So now we come to our speaker today. We are given the gift of hearing from our minister, Reverend Brian Walker, sharing his thoughts with us. And the title of his talk is Meditation Matters.
Thank you all for being here. Just really glad you're here. I just want to say, in our 24th anniversary here, it's really an honor for me to be a minister of this group, and I'm just so touched and so grateful that you all come and that we have this community. It really means a great deal to me. So anyway, meditation matters. So two men meet on the street, and one guy asks the other, he says, "How you doing?" And the other guy says, "I'm fine, thanks." And so the first guy says, "How's your son? Is he still unemployed?" And the guy says, "Yes, he is, but he's meditating now." And the guy says, "Meditating? What's that?" And the other guy says, "I don't know, but it sure beats sitting around doing nothing." So this story reminds me of when I first started meditating, which was actually over 40 years ago, and it was before I found unity. In the late 70s, I read a book called The Relaxation Response by Herbert Benson, who was a Harvard physiologist who had done some research on people who were meditating and found that it had some really beneficial physical effects. Lowered the blood pressure and lowered the heart rate and some other things. And about this same time, some other researchers had found some other interesting data about meditators, that meditators had more integrated brainwave activity than non-meditators, which actually suggested that there was improved communication between the different hemispheres of the brain. Also, again, about this time, that meditators were more resistant to stress than non-meditators. So that suggested that it could really help to improve people's psychological resilience. So that, with the suffering, the slings and arrows, as they say, of life, that we can bounce back more easily. Now, since that time, since the 1960s particularly, there have been thousands of research papers published on meditation and its effects. So I won't read you the whole list, but I'll just start. Reduction of anxiety, reduction in allergic skin reactions, decreased incidence of angina, chest pain, and cardiac arrhythmias, relief from bronchial asthma and coughs, and there are several more. Okay, but I think you get the idea that there's something that happens when we meditate that really, that really works well for us physically and psychologically. So because there were other studies that showed that school children and college students who meditate showed significant positive effects on social competence and well-being. In addition, they did research on veterans who suffered from PTSD and found that meditation significantly helped them with their symptoms. But one of the most exciting symptoms has been discovered in the last decade or so, and that is that our brains actually change from meditation. So they did research on meditators for longtime meditators, and they found that contrary to what had previously been believed, that as adults, the structures of our brains were basically the same and didn't change, but that there is this neuroplasticity that our brains can actually change. And they found more gray matter in these meditators who had meditated for a long time. And shockingly, this stimulated some folks to do some research that tried an 8-week study of people who weren't meditators and found that even after 8 weeks, they could measure a difference of more gray matter in the brain. and hence the headaches, that followed from that. No, I'm just kidding. That's a joke. It's a joke. So anyway, when I started meditating, getting back to the story, I had this little voice that said, what are you doing? This is stupid. This is crazy. This is non-productive. You've got things to do. Get out there and do them. And I just wondered what that was all about. But I've learned since then that actually the ego resists us meditating for a number of reasons. One is that meditation requires us to be self-aware. So we need to be aware of what's going on with us. And as we become aware of more of our thoughts and our feelings and our bodily sensations, that can be uncomfortable for the ego, but because it can shine a light on our hidden insecurities and vulnerabilities. No, I don't want to go there, but that's kind of where we're called to go. And so when we meditate, we kind of get that call of what are we trying to suppress? What are we trying to avoid dealing with? That takes a lot of our psychic energy and really robs us of really being fully present. So meditation promotes non-attachment, because in a typical meditation kind of session, we're letting go of whatever comes to our awareness. And so this can be difficult for the ego because it wants to hold on to what it's familiar with and what it knows, and is aware that as you let go, ultimately, you could be letting go of it. So it wants to hold on. And finally, meditation leads to transcendence, that is, to our awareness that there's a greater reality, whatever you want to call it, and that's what our true identity is. And so as we transcend the ego, we experience our true nature, our deepest nature, our true selves. And so that's really the ultimate threat to the ego, is that you're going to discover that the ego is not who you really are. There's something deeper than that, and that is what we can ultimately identify with. So the definition of meditation that I really like is that meditation is the art of union with reality. That's capital R, reality. And if you prefer to use God or some other kind of name, that works just as well. The art of union with reality, or God. So what I love about that is that it's an art. And so that means that we can practice it and get better at it. And that's always very hopeful for me. As Emily Cady, who is one of Unity's foundational writers and wrote one of the foundational texts called Lessons in Truth, she writes in Lessons in Truth, talking about the silence. No one can grow in either spiritual knowledge or power without it. Practice the presence of God just as you would practice music, so that you have some sort of program that you do on a regular basis that calls you to your attention of your self-awareness and your true self. So the ego subverts our drive to meditate, or our call to meditate, in various ways. One is it gives us all of these thoughts that want to draw us other places, namely back to it, saying, yes, I am the center of your life, and don't forget me. And also, as I experience, and I think a lot of people who start meditating experience, is the real judgment of the practice. You're no good at this. This is a waste of time. What is your problem? So it's that can be a real challenge. Now, fortunately, I had fortified myself and satisfied my rational mind that this actually did make sense because I'd done my homework beforehand. Otherwise, I could have easily given up right away. In fact, when I was at Unity Village, I was at Unity Village for 8 years, and during that time, I did a number of things, and one of those was to teach meditation classes in the adult education program. And so I would invariably have people who would come to me and say, I can't meditate. And so what I would suggest to them is that, in the process of learning meditation, that you're actually finding out how uncontrollable your mind is and how it moves so quickly in all these different directions. And that you actually can meditate, but just not as well as you would like. And that's where the practice comes in, is that you do it, and if you stick with it, you can get better at it. But in this day and age, when we live these fast-paced lives in our culture and we want results now, we want instant enlightenment that's going to last us forever. It reminds me of, in the Zen tradition, there's a story of a novice who hasn't been in the monastery too long. And he's sitting on the cushion, and he has this amazing experience, blissful, mind-expanding, awe-inspiring, mystical experience with images and music, and it's the ultimate. He jumps off his cushion, runs down the hall, bursts into the Zen master's room, and explains to him what has happened and that this is the ultimate experience. And the Zen master just sits there and says, "It'll pass." In the same vein, Jack Kornfield, who's a well-known meditation teacher, wrote a book called After the Ecstasy, the Laundry. And the title pretty much echoes the same kind of sentiment, and that is, in the book, Jack says, yes, there is enlightenment. There is this unbounded freedom and joy. There is this oneness with the divine. But in our imperfect human lives, we have to come down and be grounded in this human experience that we're having. And then we go do the laundry, because that's the stuff that we're called to do every day. So I want to take a step back and look at a bigger picture. And go back 100 years or more. And this is when Sigmund Freud, the father of psychoanalysis, scandalized everybody in the Western world by his idea that we're not the fully conscious, rational creatures that we like to think that we are actually driven by really powerful, unconscious forces deep within us. And that was very sobering for people, because it brought them to this awareness, or at least to this potential that, we're not even masters of our own house in our own minds. And another really famous psychologist, William James, was living at about the same time. And he had come to the same kind of conclusion, that he was aware that the education par excellence would be one in which it really taught us how we could control our mind and how we could really focus. There's a saying that maybe you heard of, the mind is a wonderful servant, but a terrible master. And so to be able to master that would be really what all of us want, and would be really an amazing education. But he couldn't find it. And so he gave up, as did much of Western psychology for most of the 20th century. Where there was this idea that, we can't really get hold of this monkey mind, as the Buddhists call it, that swings around and we can't really control. But the great religious traditions took a very different perspective and said, yes, we can control it, and we must be able to have sustained concentration in our minds and in our beings. And so every tradition had some form of meditation which focused on this idea that we can control the mind and it doesn't have to control us. So that now meditation is a worldwide practice in all the religious traditions, and it is something that anybody who partakes of it can benefit from. And this is true in our New Thought history as well. So unity, religious science, all of our New Thought traditions teach this as well, that getting quiet, calming the mind, focusing is a really important practice, and that it's something that we should do. In unity tradition, we call it the silence. So when I lead us into a meditation, typically on a Sunday, the last thing I say is in the silence, because that's where we go, to this quiet place in our own hearts. Now, in the founding stories of unity, typically there's a lot of attention paid to Myrtle Fillmore. And for those of you not familiar with the story, Myrtle and Charles Fillmore, the founders of the Unity movement in the late 1880s, went to a class that was taught by a Christian Science person. And Myrtle heard the expression that you do not inherit illness because you are a child of God. And that just lit her fire. And she, from that seed that was planted, because she'd been sickly for a long time and had been diagnosed with tuberculosis, which in those days was basically a death sentence. It was just a question of time. And so she prayed affirmative prayers and spent a lot of time in the silence, and she healed herself. And that is, the seed of our movement. Now, Charles, her husband, he went to the same lecture, and as he writes about subsequently, it didn't kind of click with him quite the way it did with Myrtle. But he saw what was happening in her life. She was getting better, and the neighbors heard about it, and they were coming over and talking to her, and they were getting better. So Charles really wanted to connect with this process that he could see that was happening with his wife, and he wanted to partake of that himself. So he read, he was a smart guy, he took classes, and it still wasn't quite clicking in the way that he wanted it to, because based on all the people that he was talking to, that there was a path that you could get to understand and to make connection with God, the divine reality, again, whatever you want to call it. So he made this decision. He said, I'm going to quit looking at all these other places, and I'm going to go to this Tower of Babel. I'm going to abandon this, and I'm going straight to the top. If God's out there someplace, I'm finding him, her, it. And so I want to read to you what he writes about his subsequent experience. And this is a quoting from what he writes. I then commenced sitting in the silence every night at a certain hour and tried to get in touch with God. There was no enthusiasm about it, no soul desire, but cold, calculating business method. Does this not sound like a male? I was there on time every night and tried all conceivable ways to realize that my mind was in touch with the Supreme Mind. In this cold, intellectual attitude, one can easily understand why I did not seem to get any conscious result, but I kept at it month after month, mentally affirming words that others told me would open the way. So he hung in there and overcame this kind of initial resistance that he had. And he had this strong stimulus because he could see what was going on with his wife. So what happened is Charles soon began having these exceedingly, as he described them, exceedingly realistic dreams. And he realized that this was spirit getting in touch with him. So we all have our own experience of how that is. And he started having these dreams, and it was very, very powerful for him. And subsequently, sitting in the silence became a part of his routine for the rest of his life. And it was something that he and Myrtle promoted and believed in and said is an essential part of our practice in unity. So, back in the early 1890s, they started this, publishing this magazine called Modern Thought, and they started a prayer group known as the Society of Silent Unity. The Society of Silent Unity. And so the way that worked is in their magazine, they would publish what they called at that time a class thought. We'd think about it as an affirmation, and they called everybody to sit at the same time in the evening and think about that. And so they did. And from that grew this subsequent ministry that was called the Society of Silent Help, and its name was later changed to Silent Unity, and then it grew to phones, and now they get millions of phone calls every day. And so Silent Unity's prayer ministry is famous, actually. It's the home of the daily word, and a lot of people know about it and call it. Not just New Thought people, Unity and Religious Science people, but all kinds of people call there for prayer. Oh, and for those of you who don't know, I worked there myself for 8 years when I was back there at Unity Village. And I want to share some of that with you. Because one of the things as I was reflecting on this talk was it really I became aware of, the name that they chose is Silent Unity. It wasn't, affirmative prayer unity or call for prayer unity or whatever. It was Silent Unity. And so this is, and I'll just read, because I know you can't all see that. This is a brochure that you used to be able to get. It's better than the stuff they have now. So anyway, it's Silent Unity, the light that shines for you. And so I want to show that one slide here, Chris. But I just want to read a little bit from this little booklet here. So this is in architectural terms, this is called a cupola. And this sits up on top of the Silent Unity building, the Silent Unity prayer building. And it is the light that shines for you. Okay, and so there's this metaphor about there being a light, and that at Silent Unity we hold to this light. And I used to go in the employee entrance. Above the employee entrance is a little plaque that has a scriptural verse on it, Matthew 5:14. You are the light of the world. You are the light of the world. And so I was always very deeply touched and reminded that this is really very sacred work, and that we're holding to the truth of that there's a light, and that we're all part of that. And that when you make connection with this ministry, that it is calling you to that place of knowing who you are and that the power that you have. But anyway, so I just want to read this part about, it says, true prayer goes beyond words. True prayer is an attitude of heart and mind, of receptivity and thanksgiving. It is being aware, regardless of any outward action, of the presence of God. It is the inward, silent knowing of the soul that all it really needs is God, and that in this realization is to be found the guidance, the wholeness, the peace, the joy. The first step to such a realization is serenity, and so we begin to pray by relaxing. Praying or sitting in the silence, as it is sometimes called, should not become an effort or source of stress. If you find yourself being anxious, upset, or worried, relax your body and remember that it is God, not you, who does the work. Your role is simply to let God be God in you. to let God be God in you. So when I think about, my initial experience of trying to meditate and, using these rational reasons that my ego is fighting me on to just come back and settle into that place of let God be God in me. Now, so again, focusing on the silent part, because for those of you who don't know, if you call Silent Unity, and you can make a prayer request, and there will be somebody on the other end of the line, and they'll say this beautiful prayer with you from a consciousness of oneness, that is knowing that God is present in all persons and in all circumstances, and it's called affirmative prayer. But above and beyond that, so when you get to the end of the call, this prayer person will say, and we'll hold your prayer request in our prayer vigil chapel continuously for 30 days. So what you may not be aware of is that there is a prayer vigil chapel where somebody is in the silence all the time. And that's that heart of that, what describes as true prayer, that's where all of that energy comes from, is the silence. And that we're holding that silence all the time. So now there actually is, there is a place where you can virtually go to Silent Unity's Prayer Vigil Chapel. So I want to show you that experience. So there's no sound to this, and just as you watch this, just note the lantern and note the doors as well. So just see the lantern on the right there. So what I want you to understand is the way the system works here. So now, so when you come to work at Silent Unity, and again, I'm describing 15 years ago, it might change a little bit by now, but there'd be close to 20 of us. This is on a day shift. And everybody would get assigned a time to be in the prayer vigil chapel. And those are on half-hour segments, so that there was somebody in there all the time. And when it came your time, say like, if I was to be at 11 o'clock, I would about 5 to 11, a few minutes before 11, go down and stand in front of those doors that you saw there. And then there's a clock that's in there. And as soon as it's on the hour, on the half hour, the switch is made. And so the new person that's coming in, or there could be several people, would make the switch and the people would go out. Now, really important to understand that sometimes there being human beings involved in this, there would get some sort of miscommunication, or somebody would forget and they wouldn't be there. So in other words, you'd be there holding the silence in the prayer vigil chapel, and the time would come and there's nobody out there. Well, so this is really sacred. And one of the things that everybody was taught, that you never, ever leave that room unattended. Absolutely, totally sacred. So that if there's nobody there, there's actually a phone inside the prayer vigil chapel, so that you can call to somebody and say, hey, some bozo didn't show up. So, and then they send the next person up there, or remind somebody, or find out if there wasn't a schedule, or whatever, solve the problem. But so one other thing that happens is, because Missouri is in the tornado belt, we sometimes get threatened with tornadoes. Now this is, the prayer vigil chapel is on the second floor. So when that happens, that means you got to go down to the basement. So the reason that I wanted to call your attention to the lantern is because in a very sacred ceremony, we take that lantern down to the basement and we keep the prayer vigil chapel going. We just do it down in the basement because bad things could happen. So I really wanted to, since our theme for the month is silence, and I really wanted you to really get that in the Unity tradition, that silence is really very important and very sacred. And so when we talk about Silent Unity, that's the real heart of it. Charles Fillmore wrote, "The greatest power in the world is the power of silence. And Myrtle wrote, silence is the language of the soul. It is the language of God. So spending some time in the silence is way more than sitting around doing nothing. It's really a profound experience that you can have, and it's an art that you have the opportunity to really change your consciousness physically in your brain, that you'll add more gray matter up there. So I'll just close with this saying by Lao Tzu: to the mind that is still, the whole universe surrenders. God bless you, friends.